When it comes to firearms, you get what you pay for. Better barrels, triggers, and furniture. These all cost money. So what happens when a renowned firearm company strips away all the fluff to deliver a firearm that's still quality? You get the UMP 45. The German company Heckler and Koch is one of the most well-respected firearm manufacturers in the world. Known for some of the most famous weapons to exist, H&K is a company that prides itself on its innovation and quality. But while H&K is well known for staying at the forefront of firearm design, not all their firearms are groundbreaking feats of creativity. Their most well-known design is the MP5, a submachine gun chambered in 9mm that began production in 1966. It's made of stamped steel, has a cold hammer forged barrel, and fires using a roller-delayed blowback system. The MP5 is an incredibly high-quality firearm, and even though it's somewhat antiquated by modern standards, it remains one of the most popular submachine guns in the world. After the MP5, H&K would design many other firearms, and one in particular would truly push the boundaries of conventional rifle design. The G11 was a rifle meant to herald a new age of firearms. It had a built-in optic and fired caseless ammunition. Development for the G11 lasted for over 20 years and cost a significant amount of money. But ultimately, the G11 was not adopted by any country. This failed project put H&K on the verge of bankruptcy, and they would need to shift strategies to stay afloat. Luckily, H&K had a number of successful firearms, with the MP5 being one of their most popular. The obvious solution would be to continue selling MP5s to anyone who wanted one. However, there was one problem. The MP5 was an expensive weapon to produce. While the MP5's quality cannot be denied, it's much easier to win military and law enforcement contracts when selling a cheaper weapon. And of course, H&K needed to save every penny they could. So in the early 1990s, H&K began working on a new submachine gun. From the onset, the new submachine gun would be a significant departure from the MP5. H&K wanted to sell this new firearm to the American market. And during that time, 45 ACP was a popular round in the US for law enforcement. But there was a lack of modern submachine guns chambered in the round. So, H&K believed they could fill this niche and give these organizations a compelling reason to replace their MP5s. One of the most immediate changes that was decided upon was the material of the receiver. Rather than using stamped steel with small milled parts, this new submachine gun's body would be composed primarily of polymer. In addition to being less expensive than stamped steel, polymer also made the weapon lighter. Another change that was made was how the weapon would function. The MP5 is a roller-delayed blowback submachine gun. On the bolt of the weapon, there are a set of rollers that lock into the receiver of the firearm. When it's fired, these rollers delay the bolt from reciprocating right away, only unlocking when the firing pin retracts. This system, when coupled with a pistol cartridge like 9mm, makes for a firearm with very little recoil, and also is a fairly reliable system. However, like with most aspects of the MP5, it was expensive to produce. So for their new submachine gun, H&K would not use this system. Instead, this new weapon would use the direct blowback system. The bolt does not feature any rollers and is typically relatively heavy. When the bullet is fired, pressure builds in the chamber. Once the pressure builds to a certain point, the bolt will begin to cycle rearward, ejecting the casing and loading the next round. It's a very simple and reliable operating system, which also means it's fairly inexpensive to produce. By the early 90s, direct blowback submachine guns had been around for many years. so it was already a proven design. It's likely for this reason that H&K chose the direct blowback operating system. While there were many departures from the MP5, a couple features were retained. The magazine paddle release and charging handle are identical to an MP5's, making the manual of arms somewhat similar to an MP5. However, perhaps the biggest difference in manual of arms between the MP5 and the new submachine gun was that it had a bolt hold open. On the MP5, the bolt stays closed when the weapon is empty, requiring a user to either count their rounds or pull the trigger on an empty chamber to realize the weapon is empty. On the new gun, the bolt is held open on the last round, making it much easier to tell when the weapon is empty. In addition, the weapon also has a bolt release, making the reload a simple matter of pushing it, rather than locking the charging handle open and slapping it close, though it's still possible. To bring this weapon into the modern age, a number of rails were added, allowing optics, lights, and other attachments to be mounted to the firearm. And so, H&K was ready to release their new submachine gun. Dubbed the Universal Machine Pistol, or UMP, this would be H&K's attempt to revitalize the American submachine gun market. Once the UMP entered the market in the year 2000, there was an immediate interest in the weapon. Heckler and Koch was still a household name, and their new submachine gun would attract the attention of military and law enforcement agencies alike. The benefits of the UMP were apparent. It was incredibly lightweight, owing to its polymer body. This also increased the UMP's resistance to corrosion, particularly useful in maritime environments. The weapon was also very short and had a folding stock, making it easy to store and perfect for tight spaces. And the manual of arms of the UMP were fairly similar to the MP5's, meaning individuals who were already trained on the MP5 would be able to learn how to use the UMP fairly quickly. There was one particular type of user that the UMP seemed ideal for: American SWAT teams. Among its other features, the key reason for this was the round it fired. At the time, .45 ACP was considered one of the best handgun rounds in America. A relatively large handgun round that had a fair amount of so-called stopping power, the round was popular in American law enforcement. Its effective range wasn't very far, but for SWAT team assaulters, it didn't need to be. Typically, submachine guns are meant to be fired in controlled bursts. A lower rate of fire is usually preferred to make controlling the recoil of the weapon more manageable. The UMP-45 was designed to have a rate of fire of about 600 rounds per minute, slower than the MP5, which helps reduce the kick. Additionally, the UMP also has a 2-round burst mode, which allows a shooter to double tap a target quickly while still controlling ammo consumption. However, one of the UMP's most notable downsides was its recoil. The polymer body that makes the weapon so light also means there's less weight to counteract the kick. Additionally, the bolt is very heavy for the direct blowback system to function safely. However, heavy reciprocating mass leads to more recoil. While it can be controlled, it requires more effort to do so. Additional variants of the UMP chambered in .40 Smith & Wesson and 9mm were brought to market, as well as conversion kits that allowed existing UMP-45s to be swapped to the other two calibers. The UMP-45 also has seen limited use by the American military in the Iraq War. They were primarily used in close quarters combat and were somewhat popular for that purpose. The UMP-45 has been purchased by a decent number of organizations, but while it still sees some use to this day, it never achieved the goal of being the replacement for the MP5, like H&K intended. Part of this could be explained by the UMP itself. It had some improvements over the MP5, but not enough to justify replacing the latter entirely. But perhaps a more compelling reason for the UMP's lukewarm sales is the decline of submachine guns in the 21st century. There were a number of law enforcement shootings where pistol rounds were found to be insufficient to take down suspects, primarily when the suspects were wearing body armor. And while .45 ACP theoretically performs better ballistically compared to other handgun rounds, it is not an effective round at penetrating body armor. To penetrate body armor, a round must travel fast. .45 ACP is a fairly slow traveling round, which is a significant reason for why it does not do well against armor. Rifle rounds are typically much better suited to penetrate armor, as they typically travel much faster than handgun rounds. And with the advent of reliable short-barrel rifles, they have become the predominant choice for CQB, being more ballistically effective than submachine guns, while also being able to penetrate body armor. The UMP is still in service to this day, but its heyday has passed. But that hasn't stopped it from appearing in many games. The UMP has appeared in a number of games. Just like its real counterparts, the UMP in games is typically found in the hands of special police or counterterrorism units. Typically outfitted with all the modern attachments, it fills the role of being a modern close-quarters weapon for the good guys, and it's served this role in many different games. There's another aspect to the UMP's relative popularity in games. The real UMP has a rate of fire of about 600 rounds per minute, which is often emulated in games. Just as this low rate of fire was intended to help an operator control recoil in real life, this low rate of fire helps the UMP be a very controllable weapon in games. And unlike in real life, the UMP in games is often depicted with fairly low recoil per shot. A steady rate of fire with low recoil means that even novices will have little issue landing their shots. Because the UMP chambered in .45 is the one usually portrayed in games, this is often represented by having the UMP deal more damage per shot compared to other submachine guns. The combination of an easy-to-use weapon with higher damage makes it an ideal weapon for those who can't or don't want to use a higher rate of fire weapon that can be harder to control. There's one other aspect of the real UMP that surprisingly makes it in some games. The real UMP was meant to be a budget submachine gun, an alternative to the more expensive MP5. In certain games where an economy is involved, the UMP is also often a budget choice that gives players a cheap option that's good for CQB. An easy-to-use weapon that can take a number of attachments, the UMP has become a staple of shooters. Where the traits of the real weapon led to a somewhat indifferent reception, the traits of the UMP make it a fairly popular choice in games. When the downsides of reality don't get in the way, an otherwise mediocre weapon can become a dominant choice. A groundbreaking design is something many companies strive towards, but isn't something always economically feasible. The UMP was not meant to be a groundbreaking new design. It was a purpose-made conventional firearm targeting a very specific market. And for that purpose, it was relatively successful. Still used by some organizations to this day, the UMP is proof that you don't need to reinvent the wheel to make a successful product. Sometimes, all you need is a weapon that wins contracts. Sometimes, compromise is necessary. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my previous video on the H&K XM8, and make sure you subscribe for more videos like this.